Growing up as I did in Muslim Afghanistan, I was exposed early on to a narrative of world history quite different from the one that school children in Europe and the Americas routinely hear. At the time, however, it didn't shape my thinking, because I read history for fun, and in Farsi there wasn't much to read except boring textbooks. At my reading level, all the good stuff was in English. My earliest favorite was the highly entertaining Child's History of the World by a man named V.V. Hillier. It wasn't till I reread that book as an adult, many years later, that I realized how shockingly Eurocentric it was, how riddled with casual racism. I failed to notice these features as a child because Hillier told a good story. When I was 9 or 10, the historian Arnold Toynbee passed through our tiny town of Lushkurga on a journey, and someone told him of a history-loving little bookworm of an Afghan kid living there. Toynbee was interested and invited me to tea, so I sat with the florid, old British gentleman, giving shy, monosyllabic answers to his kindly questions. The only thing I noticed about the great historian was his curious habit of keeping his handkerchief in his sleeve. When we parted, however, Toynbee gave me a gift, Hendrik Willem van Loon's The Story of Mankind. The title alone thrilled me, the idea that all of mankind had a single story. Why, I was part of mankind myself, so this might be my story, in a sense, or at least might situate me in the one big story shared by all. I gulped that book down and loved it, and the Western narrative of world history became my framework ever after. All the history and historical fiction I read from then on just added flesh to those bones. I still studied the pedantic Farsi history texts assigned to us in school, but read them only to pass tests and forgot them soon after. Faint echoes of the other narrative must have lingered in me, however, because 40 years later, in the fall of 2000, when I was working as a textbook editor in the United States, it welled back up. A school publisher in Texas had hired me to develop a new high school world history textbook from scratch, and my first task was to draw up a table of contents, which entailed formulating an opinion about the overall shape of human history. The only given was the structure of the book. To fit the rhythm of the school year, the publisher ordained that it be divided into 10 units, each consisting of 3 chapters. But into what 10, or 30, parts does all of time naturally divide? World history, after all, is not a chronological list of every damn thing that ever happened, it's a chain of only the most consequential events, selected and arranged to reveal the arc of the story. It's the arc that counts. I tied into this intellectual puzzle with gusto, but my decisions had to pass through a phalanx of advisors, curriculum specialists, history teachers, sales executives, state education officials, professional scholars, and other such worthies. This is quite normal in elementary and high school textbook publishing, and quite proper, I think, because the function of these books is to convey, not challenge, society's most up-to-date consensus of what's true. A chorus of advisors empaneled to second-guess a development editor's decisions helps to ensure that the finished product reflects the current curriculum, absent which the book will not even be saleable. As we went through the process, however, I noticed an interesting tug and pull between my advisors and me. We agreed on almost everything except kept wanting to give more coverage to Islam in world history, and they kept wanting to pull it back, scale it down, parse it out as sidebars in units devoted mainly to other topics. None of us was speaking out of parochial loyalty to our own civilization. No one was saying Islam was better or worse than the West. All of us were simply expressing our best sense of which events had been most consequential in the story of humankind. Mine was so much the minority opinion that it was indistinguishable from error, so we ended up with a table of contents in which Islam constituted the central topic of just 1 out of 30 chapters. The other 2 chapters in that unit were Pre-Columbian Civilizations of the Americas and Ancient Empires of Africa. Even this, incidentally, represented expanded coverage. The best-selling world history program of the previous textbook cycle, the 1997 edition of Perspectives on the Past, addressed Islam in just 1 chapter out of 37, and half of that chapter, part of a unit called the Middle Ages, was given over to the Byzantine Empire. In short, less than a year before September 11, 2001, the consensus of expert opinion was telling me that Islam was a relatively minor phenomenon whose impact had ended long before the Renaissance. If you went strictly by our table of contents, you would never guess Islam still existed. At the time, I accepted that my judgment might be skewed. After all, I had a personal preoccupation with Islam that was part of sorting out my own identity. Not only had I grown up in a Muslim country, but I was born into a family whose one-time high social status in Afghanistan was based entirely on our reputed piety and religious learning. Our last name indicates our supposed descent from the Ansars, the helpers, those first Muslim converts of Medina who helped the Prophet Muhammad escape assassination in Mecca and thereby ensured the survival of his mission. More recently, my grandfather's great-grandfather was a locally revered Muslim mystic whose tomb remains a shrine for hundreds of his devotees to this day, and his legacy percolated down to my father's time, instilling in our clan a generalized sense of obligation to know this stuff better than the average guy. Growing up, I heard the buzz of Muslim anecdotes, commentary, and speculation in my environment, and some of it sank in, even though my own temperament somehow turned resolutely secular. And it remained secular after I moved to the United States, yet I found myself more interested in Islam here than I ever had been while living in the Muslim world. My interest deepened after 1979, when my brother embraced fundamentalist Islam. I began delving into the philosophy of Islam through writers such as Fazlur Rahman and Syed Hussein Nasir, as well as its history through academics such as Ernst Grunebaum and Albert Hourani, just trying to fathom what my brother and I were coming from, or in his case, moving toward. Given my personal stake, I could concede that I might be overestimating the importance of Islam. And yet, a niggling doubt remained. Was my assessment wholly without objective basis? Take a look at these 6 maps, snapshots of the Islamic world at 6 different dates. When I say Islamic world, I mean societies with Muslim majorities and Muslim rulers. There are, of course, Muslims in England, France, the United States, and nearly every other part of the globe, but it would be misleading, on that basis, to call London or Paris or New York a part of the Islamic world. Even by my limited definition, however, has the Islamic world not been a considerable geographical fact throughout its many centuries? Does it not remain one to this day, straddling the Asian-African landmass and forming an enormous buffer between Europe and East Asia? Physically, it spans more space than Europe and the United States combined. In the past, it has been a single political entity, and notions of its singleness and political unity resonate among some Muslims even now. Looking at these 6 maps, I still have to wonder how, on the eve of 9/11, anyone could have failed to consider Islam a major player at the table of world history. After 9/11, perceptions changed. Non-Muslims in the West began to ask what Islam was all about, who these people were, and what was going on over there. The same questions began to bombinate with new urgency for me too. That year, visiting Pakistan and Afghanistan for the first time in 38 years, I took along a book that I had found in a used bookstore in London, Islam in Modern History by the late Wilfred Cantwell Smith, a professor of religion at McGill and Harvard. Smith published his book in 1957, so the modern history of which he spoke had ended more than 40 years earlier, and yet his analyses struck me as remarkably, in fact disturbingly pertinent to the history unfolding in 2002. Smith shone new light on the information I possessed from childhood and from later reading. For example, during my school days in Kabul, I was quite aware of a man named Sayyid Jamal-ud-Din Afghan. Like everyone, I knew he was a towering figure in modern Islamic history, but frankly I never fathomed how he had earned his acclaim, beyond the fact that he espoused pan-Islamism, which seemed like mere pallid Muslim chauvinism to me. Now, reading Smith, I realized that the basic tenets of Islamism, the political ideology making such a clatter around us in 2001, had been hammered out 100+ years earlier by this intellectual Karl Marx of Islamism. How could his very name be unknown to most non-Muslims? I plowed back into Islamic history, no longer in a quest for personal identity, but in an effort to make sense of the alarming developments among Muslims of my time, the horror stories in Afghanistan, the tumult in Iran, the insurgencies in Algeria, the Philippines, and elsewhere, the hijackings and suicide bombings in the Middle East, the hardening extremism of political Islam, and now the emergence of the Taliban. Surely, a close look at history would reveal how on earth it had come to this. And gradually, I came to realize how it had come to this. I came to perceive that, unlike the history of France or Malta or South America, the history of the Islamic lands over there was not a subset of some single world history shared by all. It was more like a whole alternative world history unto itself, competing with and mirroring the one I had tried to create for that Texas publisher, or the one published by McDougall Little, for which I had written the Islam chapters. The two histories had begun in the same place, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers of ancient Iraq, and they had come to the same place, this global struggle in which the West and the Islamic world seemed to be the major players. In between, however, they had passed through different and yet strangely parallel landscapes. Yes, strangely parallel. Looking back, for example, from within the Western world historical framework, one sees a single big empire towering above all others back there in ancient times. It is Rome, where the dream of a universal political state was born. Looking back from anywhere in the Islamic world, one also sees a single definitive empire looming back there, embodying the vision of a universal state, but it isn't Rome. It is the Caliphate of early Islam. In both histories, the great early empire fragments because it simply grows too big. The decaying empire is then attacked by nomadic barbarians from the north, but in the Islamic world, the north refers to the steppes of Central Asia, and in that world the nomadic barbarians are not the Germans but the Turks. In both, the invaders dismember the big state into a patchwork of smaller kingdoms permeated throughout by a single, unifying religious orthodoxy, Catholicism in the West, Sunni Islam in the East. World history is always the story of how we got to the here and now, so the shape of the narrative inherently depends on who we mean by we and what we mean by here and now. Western world history traditionally presumes that here and now is democratic industrial, and post-industrial, civilization. In the United States, the further presumption holds that world history leads to the birth of its founding ideals of liberty and equality and to its resultant rise as a superpower leading the planet into the future. This premise establishes a direction for history and places the endpoint somewhere down the road we're traveling now. It renders us vulnerable to the supposition that all people are moving in this same direction, though some are not quite so far along either because they started late, or because they're moving more slowly, for which reason we call their nations developing countries. When the ideal future envisioned by post-industrialized, Western democratic society is taken as the endpoint of history, the shape of the narrative leading to here and now features something like the following stages. 1. Birth of civilization Egypt and Mesopotamia. 2. Classical Age Greece and Rome. 3. The Dark Ages rise of Christianity. 4. The Rebirth, Renaissance and Reformation. 5. The Enlightenment exploration and science. 6. The revolutions democratic, industrial, technological. 7. Rise of nation-states, the struggle for empire. 8. World Wars I and II. 9. The Cold War. 10. The triumph of democratic capitalism. But what if we look at world history through Islamic eyes? Are we apt to regard ourselves as stunted versions of the West, developing toward the same endpoint, but less effectually? I think not. For one thing, we would see a different threshold dividing all of time into before and after. The year zero for us would be the year of Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina, his hijrah, which gave birth to the Muslim community. For us, this community would embody the meaning of civilized, and perfecting this ideal would look like the impulse that had given history its shape and direction. But in recent centuries, we would feel that something had gone awry with the flow. We would know the community had stopped expanding, had grown confused, had found itself permeated by a disruptive crosscurrent, a competing historical direction. As heirs to Muslim tradition, we would be forced to look for the meaning of history in defeat instead of triumph. We would feel conflicted between two impulses, changing our notion of civilized to align with the flow of history or fighting the flow of history to realign it with our notion of civilized. If the stunted present experienced by Islamic society is taken as the here and now to be explained by the narrative of world history, then the story might break down to something like the following stages. 1. Ancient times, Mesopotamia and Persia. 2. Birth of Islam. 3. The Caliphate, quest for universal unity. 4. Fragmentation, age of the sultanates. 5. Catastrophe, Crusaders and Mongols. 6. Rebirth, the Three Empires era. 7. Permeation of East by West. 8. The Reform movements. 9. Triumph of the secular modernists. 10. The Islamist reaction. Literary critic Edward Said has argued that over the centuries, the West has constructed an Orientalist fantasy of the Islamic world, in which a sinister sense of otherness is mingled with envious images of decadent opulence. Well, yes, to the extent that Islam has entered the Western imagination, that has more or less been the depiction. But more intriguing to me is the relative absence of any depictions at all. In Shakespeare's day, for example, preeminent world power was centered in 3 Islamic empires. Where are all the Muslims in his canon? Missing. If you didn't know Moors were Muslims, you wouldn't learn it from Othello. Here are 2 enormous worlds side by side. What's remarkable is how little notice they have taken of each other. If the Western and Islamic worlds were 2 individual human beings, we might see symptoms of repression here. We might ask, what happened between these 2? Were they lovers once? Is there some history of abuse? But there is, I think, another less sensational explanation. Throughout much of history, the West and the core of what is now the Islamic world have been like 2 separate universes, each preoccupied with its own internal affairs, each assuming itself to be the center of human history, each living out a different narrative until the late 17th century, when the 2 narratives began to intersect. At that point, one or the other had to give way because the 2 narratives were cross-currents to each other. The West being more powerful, its current prevailed and churned the other one under. But the superseded history never really ended. It kept on flowing beneath the surface, like a riptide, and it is flowing down there still. When you chart the hot spots of the world, Kashmir, Iraq, Chechnya, the Balkans, Israel, and Palestine, Iraq, you're staking out the borders of some entity that has vanished from the maps but still thrashes and flails in its effort not to die. This is the story I tell in the pages that follow, and I emphasize story. Destiny Disrupted is neither a textbook nor a scholarly thesis. It's more like what I'd tell you if we met in a coffeehouse and you said, "What's all this about a parallel world history?" The argument I make can be found in numerous books now on the shelves of university libraries. Read it there if you don't mind academic language and footnotes. Read it here if you want the story arc. Although I am not a scholar, I have drawn on the work of scholars who sift the raw material of history to draw conclusions, and of academics who sifted the work of scholarly researchers to draw meta-conclusions. In a history spanning several thousand years, I devote what may seem like inordinate space to a brief half-century long ago, but I linger here because this period spans the career of Prophet Muhammad and his first 4 successors, the founding narrative of Islam. I recount this story as an intimate human drama, because this is the way that Muslims know it. Academics approach this story more skeptically, crediting non-Muslim sources above supposedly less objective Muslim accounts, because they are mainly concerned to dig up what really happened. My aim is mainly to convey what Muslims think happened, because that's what has motivated Muslims over the ages and what makes their role in world history intelligible. I will, however, assert one caveat here about the origins of Islam. Unlike older religions such as Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, even Christianity, Muslims began to collect, memorize, recite, and preserve their history as soon as it happened, and they didn't just preserve it but embedded each anecdote in a nest of sources, naming witnesses to each event and listing all persons who transmitted the account down through time to the one who first wrote it down, references that function like the chain of custody validating a piece of evidence in a court case. This implies only that the core Muslim stories cannot best be approached as parables. With a parable, we don't ask for proof that the events occurred, that's not the point. We don't care if the story is true, we want the lesson to be true. The Muslim stories don't encapsulate lessons of that sort, they're not stories about ideal people in an ideal realm. They come to us, rather, as accounts of real people wrestling with practical issues in the mud and murk of actual history, and we take from them what lessons we will. Which is not to deny that the Muslim stories are allegorical, nor that some were invented, nor that many or even all were modified by tellers along the way to suit agendas of the person or moment. It is only to say that the Muslims have transmitted their foundational narrative in the same spirit as historical accounts, and we know about these people and events in much the same way that we know what happened between Sulla and Marius in ancient Rome. These tales lie somewhere between history and myth, and telling them stripped of human drama falsifies the meaning they have had for Muslims, rendering less intelligible the things Muslims have done over the centuries. This then is how I plan to tell the story, and if you're on board with me, buckle in and let's begin. Chapter 1, The Middle World. Long before Islam was born, two worlds took shape between the Atlantic Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. Each coalesced around a different network of trade and travel routes, one of them, mainly sea routes, the other, land routes. If you look at ancient sea traffic, the Mediterranean emerges as the obvious center of world history, for it was here that the Mycenaeans, Cretans, Phoenicians, Lydians, Greeks, Romans, and so many other vigorous early cultures met and mingled. People who lived within striking distance of the Mediterranean could easily hear about and interact with anyone else who lived within striking distance of the Mediterranean, and so this great sea itself became an organizing force drawing diverse people into one another's narratives and weaving their destinies together to form the germ of a world history, and out of this came Western civilization. If you look at ancient overland traffic, however, the grand central station of the world was the nexus of roads and routes connecting the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, the Iranian highlands, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, roads that ran within a territory ringed by rivers and seas: the Persian Gulf, the Indus and Oxus rivers, the Aral, Caspian, and Black Seas, the Mediterranean, the Nile, and the Red Sea. This eventually became the Islamic world. Unfortunately, common usage assigns no single label to this second area. A portion of it is typically called the Middle East, but giving one part of it a name obscures the connectedness of the whole, and besides, the phrase Middle East assumes that one is standing in Western Europe if you're standing in the Persian highlands. For example, the so-called Middle East is actually the Middle West. Therefore, I prefer to call this whole area from the Indus to Istanbul the Middle World, because it lies between the Mediterranean world and the Chinese world. The Chinese world was, of course, its own universe and had little to do with the other two, and that's to be expected on the basis of geography alone. China was cut off from the Mediterranean world by sheer distance and from the Middle World by the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert, and the jungles of Southeast Asia, a nearly impenetrable barrier, which is why China and its satellites and rivals barely enter the world history centered in the Middle World, and why they come in for rare mention in this book. The same is true of sub-Saharan Africa, cut off from the rest of Eurasia by the world's biggest desert. For that matter, the Americas formed yet another distinct universe with a world history of its own, which is for geographic reasons even more to be expected. Geography, however, did not separate the Mediterranean and Middle Worlds as radically as it isolated China or the Americas. These two regions coalesced as different worlds because they were what historian Philip D. Curtin has called intercommunicating zones. Each had more interaction internally than it had with the other. From anywhere near the Mediterranean coast, it was easier to get to some other place near the Mediterranean coast than to Persepolis or the Indus River. Similarly, caravans on the overland routes crisscrossing the Middle World in ancient times could strike off in any direction at any intersection. There were many such intersections. As they traveled west, however, into Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, the very shape of the land gradually funneled them down into the world's narrowest bottleneck, the bridge, if there happened to be one at the given time, across the Bosporus Strait. This tended to choke overland traffic down to a trickle and turn the caravans back toward the center or south along the Mediterranean coast. Gossip, stories, jokes, rumors, historical impressions, religious mythologies, products, and other detritus of culture flow along with traders, travelers, and conquerors. Trade and travel routes thus function like capillaries, carrying civilizational blood. Societies permeated by a network of such capillaries are apt to become characters in one another's narratives, even if they disagree about who the good guys and the bad guys are. Thus it was that the Mediterranean and Middle worlds developed somewhat distinct narratives of world history. People living around the Mediterranean had good reason to think of themselves at the center of human history, but people living in the Middle world had equally good reason to think they were situated at the heart of it all. These two world histories overlapped, however, in the strip of territory where you now find Israel, where you now find Lebanon, where you now find Syria and Jordan, where you now, in short, find so much trouble. This was the eastern edge of the world defined by sea lanes and the western edge of the world defined by land routes. From the Mediterranean perspective, this area has always been part of the world history that has the Mediterranean as its seed and core. From the other perspective, it has always been part of the Middle world that has Mesopotamia and Persia at its core. Is there not now, and has there not often been, some intractable argument about this patch of land? Whose world is this a part of? The Middle world before Islam. The first civilizations emerged along the banks of various big slow-moving rivers subject to annual floods. The Huanghe Valley in China, the Indus River Valley in India, the Nile Valley in Africa. These are places where, some 6,000 years ago or more, nomadic hunters and herders settled down, built villages, and became farmers. Perhaps the most dynamic petri dish of early human culture was that fertile wedge of land between the Tigris and Euphrates known as Mesopotamia, which means, in fact, between the rivers. Incidentally, the narrow strip of land flanked by these two rivers almost exactly bisects the modern-day nation of Iraq. When we speak of the Fertile Crescent as the cradle of civilization, we're talking about Iraq. This is where it all began. One key geographical feature sets Mesopotamia apart from some of the other early hotbeds of culture. Its two defining rivers flow through flat, habitable plains and can be approached from any direction. Geography provides no natural defenses to the people living here, unlike the Nile, for example, which is flanked by marshes on its eastern side, by the uninhabitable Sahara on the west, and by rugged cliffs at its upper end. Geography gave Egypt continuity but also reduced its interactions with other cultures, giving it a certain stasis. Not so, Mesopotamia. Here, early on, a pattern took hold that was repeated many times over the course of 1,000+ years, a complex struggle between nomads and city dwellers, which kept spawning bigger empires. The pattern went like this: settled farmers would build irrigation systems supporting prosperous villages and towns. Eventually some tough guy, some well-organized priest, or some alliance of the two would bring a number of these urban centers under the rule of a single power, thereby forging a larger political unit, a confederation, a kingdom, an empire. Then a tribe of hardy nomads would come along, conquer the monarch of the moment, seize all his holdings, and in the process expand their empire. Eventually the hardy nomads would become soft, luxury-loving city dwellers, exactly the sort of people they had conquered, at which point another tribe of hardy nomads would come along, conquer them, and take over their empire. Conquest, consolidation, expansion, degeneration, conquest — this was the pattern. It was codified in the 14th century by the great Muslim historian Ibn Khaldun, based on his observations of the world he lived in. Ibn Khaldun felt that in this pattern he had discovered the underlying pulse of history. At any given time, this process was happening in more than one place, one empire developing here, another sprouting there, both empires expanding until they bumped up against each other, at which point one would conquer the other, forging a single new and bigger empire. About 5,500 years ago, a dozen or so cities along the Euphrates coalesced into a single network called Sumer. Here, writing was invented, the wheel, the cart, the potter's wheel, and an early number system. Then the Akkadians, rougher fellows from upriver, conquered Sumer. Their leader, Sargon, was the first notable conqueror known to history by name, a ferocious fellow by all accounts and the ultimate self-made man, for he started out poor and unknown but left records of his deeds in the form of clay documents stamped with cuneiform, which basically said, "This one rose up and I smote him, that one rose up and I smote him." Sargon led his armies so far south they were able to wash their weapons in the sea. There he said, "Now, any king who wants to call himself my equal, wherever I went, let him go." Meaning, let's just see anyone else conquer as much as I have. His empire was smaller than New Jersey. In time, a fresh wave of nomadic ruffians from the highlands came down and conquered Akkad, and they were conquered by others, and they by others, Gutians, Kassites, Hurrians, Amorites. The pattern kept repeating. Look closely and you'll see new rulers presiding over basically the same territory, but always more of it. The Amorites clocked a crucial moment in this cycle when they built the famous city of Babylon, and from this capital ruled the first Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians gave way to the Assyrians, who ruled from the even bigger and grander city of Nineveh. Their empire stretched from Iraq to Egypt, and you can imagine how enormous such a realm must have seemed at a time when the fastest way to get from one place to another was by horse. The Assyrians acquired a nasty reputation in history as merciless tyrants. It's hard to say if they were really worse than others of their time, but they did practice a strategy Stalin made infamous in the 20th century. They uprooted whole populations and moved them to other places, on the theory that people who had lost their homes and lived among strangers, cut off from familiar resources, would be too confused and unhappy to organize rebellion. It worked for a while, but not forever. The Assyrians fell at last to one of their subject peoples, the Chaldeans, who rebuilt Babylon and won a lustrous place in history for their intellectual achievements in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. They used a base 12 system, as opposed to our base 10 system, and were pioneers in the measurement and division of time, which is why the year has 12 months, the hour has 60 minutes, 5 times 12, and the minute has 60 seconds. They were terrific urban planners and architects. It was a Chaldean king who built those hanging gardens of Babylon, which the ancients ranked among the 7 wonders of the world. But the Chaldeans followed the Assyrian strategy of uprooting whole populations in order to divide and rule. Their king Nebuchadnezzar was the one who first smashed Jerusalem and dragged the Hebrews into captivity. It was also a Chaldean king of Babylonia, Belshazzar, who, while feasting in his palace one night, saw a disembodied hand write on his wall in letters of fire, "Many many tekel up Harson." His sycophants couldn't make heads or tails of these words, probably because they were blind drunk, but also because the words were written in some strange tongue, Aramaic, as it happens. They sent for the Hebrew captive Daniel, who said the words meant, "Your days are numbered, you've been weighed and found wanting, your kingdom will be divided." At least so goes the Old Testament story in the book of Daniel. Belshazzar barely had time to ponder the prophecy before it came true. A sudden blistering bloodbath was unleashed upon Babylon by the newest gang of ruffians from the highlands, an alliance of Persians and Medes. These two Indo-European tribes put an end to Second Babylonia and replaced it with the Persian Empire. At this point, the recurrent pattern of ever bigger empires in the heart of the Middle World came to an end, or at least to a long pause. For one thing, by the time the Persians were done, there wasn't much left to conquer. Both cradles of civilization, Egypt and Mesopotamia, ended up as part of their realm. Their suzerainty stretched west into Asia Minor, south to the Nile, and east through the Iranian highlands and Afghanistan to the Indus River. The perfumed and polished Persians probably saw no point in further conquest. South of the Indus lay steaming jungles, and north of Afghanistan stretched harsh steppes raked by bitter winds and roamed by Turkish nomads eking out a bare existence with their herds and flocks. Who even wanted to rule that? The Persians therefore contented themselves with building a string of forts to keep the barbarians out, so that decent folks might pursue the arts of civilized living on the settled side of the fence. By the time the Persians took charge, around 550 BCE, a lot of consolidation had already been done. In each region, earlier conquerors had drawn various local tribes and towns into single systems ruled by one monarch from a central capital, whether Elam, Ur, Nineveh, or Babylon. The Persians profited from the work, and bloodshed, of their predecessors. Yet the Persian Empire stands out for several reasons. First, the Persians were the counter-Assyrians. They developed a completely opposite idea of how to rule a vast realm. Instead of uprooting whole nations, they resettled them. They set the Hebrews free from captivity and helped them get back to Canaan. The Persian emperors pursued a multicultural, many people under one big tent strategy. They controlled their enormous realm by letting all the different constituent people live their own lives according to their own folkways and mores, under the rule of their own leaders, provided they paid their taxes and submitted to a few of the emperor's mandates and demands. The Muslims later picked up on this idea, and it persisted through Ottoman times. Second, the Persians saw communication as a key to unifying, and thus controlling, their realm. They promulgated a coherent set of tax laws and issued a single currency for their realm, currency being the medium of communication in business. They built a tremendous network of roads and studded it with hostels to make travel easy. They developed an efficient postal system, too, an early version of the Pony Express. That quote you sometimes see associated with the U.S. Postal Service, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, comes from ancient Persia. The Persians also employed a lot of translators. You couldn't get away with saying, "But, officer, I didn't know it was against the law, I don't speak Persian." Translators enabled the emperors to broadcast written descriptions of their splendor and greatness in various languages so that all their subjects could admire them. Darius, the Great, who brought the Persian Empire to one of its several peaks, had his life story carved into a rock at a place called Behistun. He had it inscribed in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, 15,000 characters devoted to Darius's deeds and conquests, detailing the rebels who had tried and failed to topple him and the punishments he had meted out to them, essentially communicating that you did not want to mess with this emperor, he'd cut off your nose, and worse. Nonetheless, citizens of the empire found Persian rule basically benign. The well-oiled imperial machinery kept the peace, which let ordinary folks get on with the business of raising families, growing crops, and making useful goods. The part of Darius's Behistun inscription written in Old Persian was decipherable from modern Persian, so after it was rediscovered in the 19th century, scholars were able to use it to unlock the other 2 languages and thus gain access to the cuneiform libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, libraries so extensive that we know more about daily life in this area 3,000 years ago than we know about daily life in Western Europe 1,200 years ago. Religion permeated the Persian world. It wasn't the million gods idea of Hinduism, nor was it anything like the Egyptian pantheon of magical creatures with half human and half animal shapes, nor was it like Greek paganism, which saw every little thing in nature as having its own god, a god who looked human and had human frailties. No, in the Persian universe, Zoroastrianism held pride of place. Zoroaster lived about 1,000 years before Christ, perhaps earlier or perhaps later, no one really knows. He hailed from northern Iran, or maybe northern Afghanistan, or maybe somewhere east of that, no one really knows that, either. Zoroaster never claimed to be a prophet or channeler of divine energy, much less a divinity or deity. He considered himself a philosopher and seeker. But his followers considered him a holy man. Zoroaster preached that the universe was divided between darkness and light, between good and evil, between truth and falsehood, between life and death. The universe split into these opposing camps at the moment of creation, they had been locked in struggle ever since, and the contest would endure to the end of time. People, said Zoroaster, contain both principles within themselves. They choose freely whether to go this way or that. By choosing good, people promote the forces of light and life. By choosing evil, they give strength to the forces of darkness and death. There is no predestination in the Zoroastrian universe. The outcome of the great contest is always in doubt, and not only is every human being free to make moral choices, but every moral choice affects that cosmic outcome. Zoroaster saw the drama of the universe vested in two divinities, not one, not thousands, but two. Ahura Mazda embodied the principle of good, Ahriman the principle of evil. Fire served as an iconic representation of Ahura Mazda, which has led some to characterize Zoroastrians as fire worshippers, but what they worship is not fire per se, it's Ahura Mazda. Zoroaster spoke of an afterlife but suggested that the good go there not as a reward for being good but as a consequence of having chosen that direction. You might say they lift themselves to heaven by the bootstraps of their choices. The Persian Zoroastrians rejected religious statues, imagery, and icons, laying the basis for the hostility toward representation in religious art that re-emerged forcefully in Islam. Sometimes Zoroaster, or at least his followers, called Ahura Mazda the wise lord and spoke as if he was actually the creator of the entire universe and as if it was he who had divided all of creation into two opposing aspects a short time after the moment of creation. Thus, Zoroaster's dualism inched toward monotheism, but it never quite arrived there. In the end, for the ancient Persian Zoroastrians, two deities with equal power inhabited the universe, and human beings were the rope in a tug of war between them. A Zoroastrian priest was called a magus, the plural of which is magi, the three wise men of the East who, according to the Christian story, brought myrrh and frankincense to the infant Jesus in his stable were Zoroastrian priests. The word magician also derives from magi. These priests were thought by others and sometimes themselves claimed, to possess miraculous powers. In the late days of the empire, the Persians broke into the Mediterranean world and made a brief, big splash in Western world history. Persian Emperor Darius sallied west to punish the Greeks. I say punish, not invade or conquer, because from the Persian point of view the so-called Persian Wars were not some seminal clash between two civilizations. The Persians saw the Greeks as the primitive inhabitants of some small cities on the far western edges of the civilized world, cities that implicitly belonged to the Persians, even though they were too far away to rule directly. Emperor Darius wanted the Greeks merely to confirm that they were his subjects by sending him a jar of water and a box of soil in symbolic tribute. The Greeks refused. Darius collected an army to go teach the Greeks a lesson they would never forget, but the very size of his army was as much a liability as an asset. How do you direct so many men at such a distance? How do you keep them supplied? Darius had ignored the first principle of military strategy: never fight a land war in Europe. In the end, it was the Greeks who taught the Persians an unforgettable lesson, a lesson that they quickly forgot. However, for less than one generation later, Darius's dim-witted son Xerxes decided to avenge his father by repeating and compounding his mistakes. Xerxes, too, came limping home, and that was the end of Persia's European adventure. It didn't end there, however. About 150 years later, Alexander the Great took the battle the other way. We often hear of Alexander the Great conquering the world, but what he really conquered was Persia, which had already conquered the world. With Alexander, the Mediterranean narrative broke forcefully in upon the Middle World I. Alexander dreamed of blending the two into one, of uniting Europe and Asia. He was planning to locate his capital at Babylon. Alexander cut deep and made a mark. He appears in many Persian myths and stories, which give him an outsized heroic quality, though not an altogether positive one but not entirely villainous, either. A number of cities in the Muslim world are named after him. Alexandria is the obvious example, but a less obvious one is Kandahar, famous now because the Taliban consider it their capital. Kandahar was originally called Iskandar, which is how Alexander was pronounced in the East, but the is dropped away, and Kandar softened into Kandahar. But the cut Alexander inflicted dosed up, the skin grew over, and the impact of his 11 years in Asia faded. One night in Babylon he suddenly died, whether from the flu, malaria, too much drink, or poison, no one knows. He had stationed generals in various parts of the territory he had conquered, and the moment he died, the toughest ones claimed whatever terrain they happened to hold, fashioning Hellenic kingdoms that endured for a few hundred years. For example, in the kingdom of Bactria, now northern Afghanistan, artists made Greek-looking sculptures. Later, when Buddhist influences seeped north from India, the two art styles mixed, resulting in what is now known as Greco-Buddhist art. Eventually, however, those kingdoms weakened, Greek influence faded away, the Greek language fell out of use here, and the Persian substratum welled back to the surface. Another empire came to occupy much the same territory as that of the ancient Persians, though not as much of it. The new rulers called themselves Parthians, and they were formidable warriors. The Parthians battled Rome to a standstill, preventing their expansion east. Their armies were the first to include cataphracts knights in full metal armor riding huge armored horses, much like the ones we associate with Europe's feudal ages. These Parthian knights were like mobile castles. But mobile castles are cumbersome, so the Parthians had another cavalry corps as well, lightly dad men riding naked horses. As a battle tactic, the light cavalry sometimes pretended to have been routed. In the hot middle of the fighting, they would suddenly turn tail and race away. The army they were fighting would break ranks and chase after them, losing all order as they clamored, "Get 'em, boys, they're on the run, let's finish 'em." Whereupon the Parthians would suddenly wheel around and fire into the disorganized rabble their opponents had become, annihilating them in minutes. This was later known as a Parthian shot, and when you hear the phrase parting shot, you may actually be hearing a corruption of the phrase Parthian shot. The Parthians were originally nomadic herders and hunters from the mountains northeast of Persia, but once they appropriated the frame of the old Persian Empire, they became, for all practical purposes, Persians. Their name, Parthian, is probably a corruption or variation of Persian. This empire endured for centuries without leaving much of a trace, because they took little interest in art and culture, and mobile castles get recycled for scrap metal once the warriors inside them die. While they lasted, however, the Parthians protected and promoted trade, and caravans moved freely within their borders. The Parthian capital was known to the Greeks as Hekatompelos, the 100-gated, because so many roads converged there. In the bazaars of Parthian cities, you could probably hear gossip from all quarters of the empire and the societies it bordered, the Greco-Buddhist kingdoms in the east, the Hindus to the south of them, the Chinese of the further east, the waning Greek, Seleucid, kingdoms in the west, and the Armenians to their north. The Parthians had little social intercourse with the Romans, unless fighting counts. The civilizational blood that made the Parthians Persian didn't get across that border, and so again the Mediterranean and Middle worlds diverged. Around the time the Parthians began their rise, China was unified for the first time. In fact, the glory years of China's seminal Han dynasty coincide almost exactly with the period of Parthian dominance. In the west, the Romans began their great expansion near the beginning of the Parthian era. Just as Rome was beating Carthage for the first time, the Parthians were taking Babylonia. Just as Julius Caesar was tearing up Gaul, Parthian power was peaking in the Middle World. In 53 BCE the Parthians crushed the Romans in a battle, capturing 34,000 legionnaires and killing Crassus who, along with Caesar and Pompey, had been co-ruler of Rome. 30 years later, the Parthians dealt Mark Antony a stinging defeat and established the Euphrates River as the border between the two empires. The Parthians were still expanding east when Christ was born. The spread of Christianity went little noticed by the Parthians, who favored Zoroastrianism in a lukewarm sort of way. When Christian missionaries began trickling east, the Parthians let them in. They didn't care very much about religion, one way or another. The Parthians always operated on a feudal system, with power distributed down through many layers of lords. Over time, imperial power leaked away into this ever more fragmented feudalism. In the 3rd, Christian, century, a provincial rebel overthrew the last of the Parthians and founded the Sassanid dynasty, and this quickly expanded to occupy all the same territory as the Parthians and a little more besides. The Sassanids didn't alter the direction of cultural change, they only organized the empire more effectively, erased the last traces of Hellenic influence, and completed the restoration of the Persian fabric. They built monumental sculptures, enormous buildings, and imposing cities. Zoroastrianism enjoyed a huge resurgence: fire and ashes, sunlight and darkness, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. It was the state religion. Missionary monks had been roaming west from Afghanistan, teaching Buddhism, but the seeds they dropped would not grow in the soil of Zoroastrian Persia, so they turned east, which is why Buddhism spread to China but not Europe. Countless Persian tales and legends of later times go back to this Sassanid period. The greatest of the Sassanid kings, Khusro-i-Nushirvan, came to be remembered, by Persian speakers, as the archetype of the just king, conflated perhaps with Khusro, the third king of Iran's mythical first dynasty, something like an Arthurian figure presiding over a Persian Camelot and served by noble warriors. The Roman Empire, meanwhile, was falling apart. In 293, the Emperor Diocletian divided the empire in 4 parts for administrative purposes. It had grown just too huge and cumbersome to run from a single center. But Diocletian's reform ended up splitting the empire in 2. The wealth was all in the east, it turned out, so the western part of the Roman Empire crumbled. As nomadic German tribes moved into the empire, government services shrank, law and order broke down, and trade decayed. Schools foundered, Western Europeans stopped reading or writing much, and Europe sank into its so-called Dark Ages. Roman cities in places like Germany and France and Britain fell into ruin, and society simplified down to serfs, warriors, and priests. The only institution binding disparate locales together was Christianity, anchored by the Bishop of Rome, soon known as the Pope. The eastern portion of the Roman Empire, headquartered in Constantinople, continued to hang on. The locals still called this entity Rome, but to later historians it looked like something new, so retrospectively they gave it a new name, the Byzantine Empire. Orthodox Christianity was centered here. Unlike Western Christianity, this church had no pope-like figure. Each city with a sizable Christian population had its own top bishop, a metropolitan, and all the metropolitans were supposedly equal, although the top bishop of Constantinople was more equal than most. Above them all, however, stood the emperor. Western learning, technology, and intellectual activity contracted to Byzantium. Here, writers and artists continued to produce books, paintings, and other works, yet once Eastern Rome became the Byzantine Empire, it more or less passed out of Western history. Many will dispute this statement. The Byzantine Empire was Christian, after all. Its subjects spoke Greek, and its philosophers, well, let us not speak too much about its philosophers. Almost any well-educated Westerner knows of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, not to mention Sophocles, Virgil, Tacitus, Pericles, Alexander of Macedon, Julius Caesar, Augustus, and many others, but apart from academics who specialize in Byzantine history, few can name 3 Byzantine philosophers, or 2 Byzantine poets, or 1 Byzantine emperor after Justinian. The Byzantine Empire lasted almost 1,000 years, by few can name 5 events that took place in the empire during all that time. Compared to ancient Rome, the Byzantine Empire didn't wield much clout, but in its own region it was a superpower, largely because it had no competition and because its walled capital of Constantinople was probably the most impregnable city the world had ever known. By the mid-6th century, the Byzantines ruled most of Asia Minor and some of what we now call Eastern Europe. They butted right up against Sassanid Persia, the region's other superpower. The Sassanids ruled a swath of land stretching east to the foothills of the Himalayas. Between the two empires lay a strip of disputed territory, the lands along the Mediterranean shore, where the two world histories overlap and where disputes have been endemic. To the south, in the shadow of both big empires, lay the Arabian Peninsula, inhabited by numerous autonomous tribes. Such was the political configuration of the Middle World just before Islam was born. Chapter 2, The Hijra. Year 0. 622 CE. In the late 6th century of the Christian age, a number of cities flourished along the Arabian coast as hotbeds of commerce. The Arabians received goods at Red Sea ports and took camel caravans across the desert to Syria and Palestine, transporting spice and cloth and other trade goods. They went north, south, east, and west, so they knew all about the Christian world and its ideas, but also about Zoroaster and his ideas. A number of Jewish tribes lived among the Arabs. They had come here after the Romans had driven them out of Palestine. Both the Arabs and the Jews were Semitic and traced their descent to Abraham, and through him to Adam. The Arabs saw themselves as the line descended from Abraham's son Ishmael and his second wife, Hagar. The stories commonly associated with the Old Testament: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and his ark, Joseph and Egypt, Moses and the Pharaoh, and the rest of them were part of Arab tradition too. Although most of the Arabs were pagan polytheists at this point and the Jews had remained resolutely monotheistic, the two groups were otherwise more or less indistinguishable in terms of culture and lifestyle. The Jews of this area spoke Arabic, and their tribal structure resembled that of the Arabs. Some Arabs were nomadic Bedouins who lived in the desert, but others were town dwellers. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, was born and raised in the highly cosmopolitan town of Mecca, near the Red Sea coast. Meccans were wide-ranging merchants and traders, but their biggest, most prestigious business was religion. Mecca had temples to at least 100 pagan deities with names like Hubal, Manat, Alat, Al, Uzza, and Fals. Pilgrims streamed in to visit the sites, perform the rites, and do a little business on the side, so Mecca had a busy tourist industry with inns, taverns, shops, and services catering to pilgrims. Muhammad was born around the year 570. The exact date is unknown because no one was paying much attention to him at the time. His father was a poor man who died when Muhammad was still in the womb, leaving Muhammad's mother virtually penniless. Then, when Muhammad was only 6, his mother died too. Although Muhammad was a member of the Quraysh, the most powerful tribe in Mecca, he got no status out of it because he belonged to one of the tribe's poorer Dans, the Banu Hashim. Dan is house of. One gets the feeling that this boy grew up feeling quite keenly his uncertain status as an orphan. He was not abandoned, however, his close relatives took him in. He lived with his grandfather until the old man died and then with his uncle Abu Talib, who raised him like a son, yet the fact remained that he was a nobody in his culture, and outside his uncle's home he probably tasted the disdain and disrespect that was an orphan's lot. His childhood planted in him a lifelong concern for the plight of widows and orphans. When Muhammad was 25, a wealthy widowed businesswoman named Khadija hired him to manage her caravans and conduct business for her. Arab society was not kind to women as a rule, but Khadija had inherited her husband's wealth, and the fact that she held on to it suggests what a powerful and charismatic personality she must have had. Mutual respect and affection between Muhammad and Khadija led the two to marriage, a warm partnership that lasted until Khadija's death 25 years later. And even though Arabia was a polygynous society in which having only one wife must have been uncommon, Muhammad married no one else as long as Khadija lived. As an adult, then, the orphan built quite a successful personal and business life. He acquired a reputation for his diplomatic skills, and quarreling parties often called upon him to act as an arbiter. Still, as Muhammad approached the age of 40, he began to suffer what we might now call a midlife crisis. He grew troubled about the meaning of life. Looking around, he saw a society bursting with wealth, and yet amid all the bustling prosperity, he saw widows eking out a bare living on charity and orphans scrambling for enough to eat. How could this be? He developed a habit of retreating periodically to a cave in the mountains to meditate. There, one day, he had a momentous experience, the exact nature of which remains mysterious, since various accounts survive, possibly reflecting various descriptions by Muhammad himself. Tradition has settled on calling the experience a visitation from the angel Gabriel. In one account, Muhammad spoke of a silken cloth on which was some writing brought to him while he was asleep. In the main, however, it was apparently an oral and personal interaction, which started when Muhammad, meditating in the utter darkness of the cave, sensed an overwhelming and terrifying presence. Someone else was in the cave with him. Suddenly he felt himself gripped from behind so hard he could not breathe. Then came a voice, not so much heard as felt throughout his being, commanding him to recite. Muhammad managed to gasp out that he could not recite. The command came again, recite. Again Muhammad protested that he could not recite, did not know what to recite, but the angel, the voice, the impulse blazed once more, recite. Thereupon Muhammad felt words of terrible grandeur forming in his heart, and the recitation began. Recite in the name of your Lord who created humans from a drop of blood. Recite. And your Lord is most bountiful. He who taught humans by the pen, taught humans that which they knew not. Muhammad came down from the mountain sick with fear, thinking he might have been possessed by a jinn, an evil spirit. Outside, he felt a presence filling the world to every horizon. According to some accounts, he saw a light with something like a human shape within it, which was only more thunderous and terrifying. At home, he told Khadija what had happened, and she assured him that he was perfectly sane, that his visitor had really been an angel, and that he was being called into service by God. I believe in you, she said, thus becoming Muhammad's first follower, the first Muslim. At first, Muhammad preached only to his intimate friends and close relatives. For a time, he experienced no further revelations, and it depressed him. He felt like a failure. But then the revelations began to come again. Gradually, he went public with the message, until he was telling people all around Mecca, there is only one God. Submit to his will, or you will be condemned to hell, and he specified what submitting to the will of God entailed: giving up debauchery, drunkenness, cruelty, and tyranny, attending to the plight of the weak and the meek, helping the poor, sacrificing for justice, and serving the greater good. Among the many temples in Mecca was a cube-shaped structure with a much revered cornerstone, a polished black stone that had fallen out of the sky a long time ago, a meteor, perhaps. This temple was called the Kaaba, and tribal tales said that Abraham himself had built it, with the help of his son Ismail. Muhammad considered himself a descendant of Abraham and knew all about Abraham's uncompromising monotheism. Indeed, Muhammad didn't think he was preaching something new, he believed he was renewing what Abraham, and countless other prophets, had said, so he zeroed in on the Kaaba. This, he said, should be Mecca's only shrine, the Temple of Allah. Al means the in Arabic, and La, an elision of Ilah, means God. Allah, then, simply means God. This is a core point in Islam. Muhammad wasn't talking about this God versus that God. He wasn't saying, believe in a God called La because he is the biggest, strongest God, nor even that La was the only true God and all the other ones were fake. One could entertain a notion like that and still think of God as some particular being with supernatural powers, maybe a creature who looked like Zeus, enjoyed immortality, could lift 100 camels with one hand, and was the only one of its kind. That would still constitute a belief in one God. Muhammad was proposing something different and bigger. He was preaching that there is one God to all, encompassing and universal, to be associated with any particular image, any particular attributes, any finite notion, any limit. There is only God and all the rest is God's creation. This was the message he was delivering to anyone who would listen. Mecca's business leaders came to feel threatened by Muhammad because they were making good money from religious tourism. If this only one God idea took hold, they feared, the devotees of all the other gods would stop coming to Mecca and they'd be ruined. Today, ironically, over 1 million people come to Mecca each year to perform the rites of pilgrimage at the Kaaba, making this the biggest annual gathering on earth. Besides, Mecca profited from drinking dens, gambling, prostitution, and other such attractions, and the tribal power brokers could not tolerate a man railing against the very entertainments that brought in their wealth, even if he had merely a smattering of followers, many of them powerless poor people and slaves. Well, for one thing, not all his followers were poor people and slaves, they included the wealthy and respected merchants Abu Bakr and Uthman, and soon they even included the physically imposing giant Omar, who started out as one of Muhammad's most bitter enemies. The trend looked disturbing. For nearly 12 years, Muhammad's uncle Abu Talib defended him against all criticism. According to most Muslims, Abu Talib never converted to Islam himself, but he stood up for his nephew out of personal loyalty and love, and his word had weight. Khadija also backed her husband unstintingly, which gave him precious comfort. Then, in the course of a single devastating year, both these major figures in Muhammad's life died, leaving God's messenger exposed to his enemies. That year, 7 elders of the Quraysh tribe decided to have Muhammad killed while he slept, thereby getting rid of the troublemaker before he could do real damage to the economy. One of Muhammad's several uncles spearheaded the plot. In fact, all 7 plotters were related to Muhammad, but this didn't soften their resolve. Fortunately, Muhammad caught wind of the plot and worked out how to foil it with help from 2 close companions. One was his cousin Ali, now a strapping young man, who would soon marry Muhammad's daughter Fatima and become the messenger's son-in-law. Another was his best friend, Abu Bakr, Muhammad's first follower outside his immediate family circle and his closest advisor, soon to become Muhammad's father-in-law. The Prophet had already been in contact with delegates from Yathrib, another town near the Red Sea coast, some 250 miles north of Mecca. It was an agricultural rather than a commercial town, and it was torn by conflict because its inhabitants belonged to several quarreling tribes. The people of Yathrib wanted a fair-minded outsider to come in and oversee negotiations among the tribes. They hoped that if they ceded judicial authority to such a person, he would be able to bring about a peace. Muhammad had a reputation as a fair-minded and skillful arbitrator, a role he had played in several crucial disputes, and so the Yathribis thought he might be the man for the job. Several of them visited Mecca to meet Muhammad and found his charisma overwhelming. They converted to Islam and invited Muhammad to move to Yathrib as an arbiter and help put an end to all the quarreling. The Prophet accepted. Muhammad's murder was planned for a September night in the year 622 CE. That night, the Prophet and Abu Bakr slipped away into the desert. Ali crawled into Muhammad's bed to make it look like he was still there. When the would-be assassins burst in, they were furious to find Ali, but they spared the kid and sent a search party out to hunt down the Prophet. Muhammad and Abu Bakr had made it only to a cave near Mecca, but legend has it that a spider built its web across the mouth of the cave after they entered. When the posse came by and saw the web, they assumed no one could be inside, and so passed on. Muhammad and Abu Bakr made it safely to Yathrib, by which time some of Muhammad's other followers had moved there too, and the rest soon followed. Most of these Meccan emigrants had to leave their homes and property behind. Most were making a break with family members and fellow tribesmen who had not converted. But at least they were coming to a place where they would be safe, and where their leader Muhammad had been invited to preside as the city's highest authority, the arbiter among the rival tribal chieftains. True to his promise, Muhammad sat down with the city's fractious tribes to hammer out a covenant later called the Pact of Medina. This covenant made the city a confederacy, guaranteeing each tribe the right to follow its own religion and customs, imposing on all citizens rules designed to keep the overall peace, establishing a legal process by which the tribes settled purely internal matters themselves and ceded to Muhammad the authority to settle intertribal disputes. Most important, all the signatories, Muslim and non-Muslim, pledged to join all the others to defend Medina against outside attack. Although this document has been called the first written constitution, it was really more of a multi-party treaty. Muhammad also appointed one Yathribi Muslim to mentor and help each family of Meccan Muslims. The native was to host the newcomer and his family, get them settled, and help them start a new life. From this time on, the Yathribi Muslims were called the Ansar, the helpers. The name of the city changed too. Yathrib became Medina, which simply means the city, short for a phrase that meant city of the Prophet. The emigration of the Muslims from Mecca to Medina is known as the Hijra, often spelled Hijra in English. A dozen years later, when Muslims created their own calendar, they dated it from this event because the Hijra, they felt, marked the pivot of history, the turning point in their fortunes, the moment that divided all of time into before the Hijra BH, and after the Hijra AH. Some religions mark their founder's birthday as their point of origin, some, the day he died, and still others, the moment of their prophet's enlightenment or his key interaction with God. In Buddhism, for example, the religion begins with Siddhartha Gautama's achievement of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Christianity attributes key religious significance to Christ's death and resurrection as well as his birth. Islam, however, pays little attention to Muhammad's birthday. Growing up as a Muslim, I didn't know when he was born, because nothing special happened that day in Afghanistan. Some countries, such as Egypt, commemorate the day more elaborately, but still, there's no analog to Christmas in Islam, no Muhammad Maz. The revelation in the cave is commemorated as the most sacred night in Muslim devotions. It is the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, which falls on or near the 27th day of Ramadan, the month of fasting. But in the Muslim calendar of history, that event occurred 10 years before the really crucial turning point, the Hijra. What makes moving from one town to another so momentous? The Hijra takes pride of place among events in Muslim history because it marks the birth of the Muslim community, the Ummah, as it is known in Islam. Before the Hijra, Muhammad was a preacher with individual followers. After the Hijra, he was the leader of a community that looked to him for legislation, political direction, and social guidance. The word Hijra means severing of ties. People who joined the community in Medina renounced tribal bonds and accepted this new group as their transcendent affiliation, and since this community was all about building an alternative to the Mecca of Muhammad's childhood, it was an epic, devotional social project. This social project, which became fully evident in Medina after the Hijra, is a core element of Islam. Quite definitely, Islam is a religion, but right from the start, if the start is taken as the Hijra, it was also a political entity. Yes, Islam prescribes a way to be good, and yes, every devoted Muslim hopes to get into heaven by following that way, but instead of focusing on isolated individual salvation, Islam presents a plan for building a righteous community. Individuals earn their place in heaven by participating as members of that community and engaging in the Islamic social project, which is to build a world in which orphans won't feel abandoned and in which widows won't ever be homeless, hungry, or afraid. Once Muhammad became the leader of Medina, people came to him for guidance and judgments about every sort of life question, big or little: how to discipline children, how to wash one's hands, what to consider fair in a contract, what should be done with a thief. The list goes on. Questions that in many other communities would be decided by a phalanx of separate specialists, such as judges, legislators, political leaders, doctors, teachers, generals, and others, were all in the Prophet's bailiwick here. Portions of the Quran recited in Mecca consist entirely of language like this: when earth is shaken with a mighty shaking and earth brings forth her burdens. And man says, what ails her? Upon that day she shall tell her tidings, for that her Lord has inspired her. Upon that day men shall issue in scatterings to see their works, and whoso has done an atom's weight of good shall see it, and whoso has done an atom's weight of evil shall see it. When you look at the verses revealed in Medina, you still find much passionate, lyrical, and imprecatory language, but you also find passages like this one. God charges you, concerning your children, to the male the like of the portion of 2 females, and if they be women above 2, then for them 2/3 of what he leaves, but if she be one then to her a half, and to his parents to each one of the 2 the 6th of what he leaves, if he has children, but if he has no children, and his heirs are his parents, a third to his mother, or, if he has brothers, to his mother a 6th, after any bequest he may bequeath, or any debt. Your fathers and your sons, you know not which out of these is nearer in profit to you. So God apportions, surely God is all-knowing, all-wise. This is legislation, and this is what the Muslim enterprise expanded to, once it took root in Medina. After the Hijra, the native Arabs of Medina gradually converted to Islam, but the city's 3 Jewish tribes largely resisted conversion, and over time a friction developed between them and the Muslims. Among the Arabs, too, some of the men displaced by Muhammad's growing stature harbored a closely guarded resentment. Meanwhile, the Quraysh tribe had not given up on assassinating Muhammad, even though he now lived 250 miles away. Not only did Quraysh leaders put a huge bounty of 100 camels on Muhammad's head, they remained fixated on stamping out his whole community. To finance an assault on Medina, the wealthiest merchants of Mecca stepped up their trading expeditions. Muhammad countered by leading Muslims in raids on these Meccan caravans, which helped solve another problem the Meccan emigrants faced: how to support themselves now that they had lost their goods and businesses. After a year of these raids, the Meccans decided to raise the stakes. 1,000 of them strapped on weapons and marched out to finish off the upstarts. The Muslims met them with a force of 300 men at a place called Badr and defeated them soundly. The Quran mentions the Battle of Badr as proof of Allah's ability to decide the outcome of any battle, no matter what the odds. Before Badr, some of the Bedouin tribesmen had worked for merchants in Mecca as contract bodyguards. After Badr, these tribes began to switch sides. The growing solidarity of the Muslim community in Medina began to alarm the Jewish tribes. One of the three renounced the Pact of Medina and tried to instigate an uprising against Muhammad and a return to the pre-Islamic status quo, but the uprising failed, and this tribe was expelled from Medina. Now the Quraysh really did have cause to worry. Instead of eliminating Muhammad, it looked like they might have dug themselves the beginnings of a hole. In the year 3 AH, they decided to overwhelm the Muslims while they still had the numbers. They tripled the size of their army, heading for Medina with 3,000 men. The Muslims could scratch up only 950 warriors. Again, they would be outnumbered 3-1, but after Badr, how could this matter? They had the only asset that mattered: Allah was on their side. The second of Islam's three iconic battles occurred at a place called Uhud. At first the Muslims seemed to be winning again, but when the Meccans fell back, some of the Muslims disobeyed one of Muhammad's explicit orders. They broke ranks and spilled across the field in a chaotic rush to scoop up their share of booty, at which point the Meccans struck from behind, led by Khalid bin al-Walid, a military genius who later converted to Islam and became one of the Ummah's leading generals. The Prophet himself was wounded at Uhud, 70 Muslims were killed, and many of the rest fled. The Ummah survived, but this battle marked a bad defeat. These seminal battles of Islamic history were so small-scale, measured against most real wars, that they barely qualify as battles. Each one, however, was incorporated into Muslim theology and vested with meaning. Thus, the Battle of Badr showed that Allah's will, not material factors, determined victory in battle. But the Battle of Uhud raised a thorny theological question. If Badr showed the power of Allah, what did Uhud show? That Allah could also lose battles? That he was not quite as all-powerful as Muhammad proclaimed? Muhammad, however, found a different lesson in defeat. Allah, he explained, let the Muslims lose this time to teach them a lesson. The Muslims were supposed to be fighting for a righteous cause, a just community on earth. Instead, at Uhud they forgot this mission and went scrambling for loot in direct disobedience to the Prophet's orders, and so they forfeited Allah's favor. Divine support was not an entitlement. Muslims had to earn the favor of Allah by behaving as commanded and submitting to His will. This explanation for defeat provided a stencil that Muslims invoked repeatedly in later years, after the Mongol Holocaust of the 13th century, for example, when nomadic invaders from Central Asia overwhelmed most of the Islamic world, and again in response to Western domination, which began in the 18th century and continues to this day. The Quraysh spent 2 years planning their next assault. Recruiting allies from other tribes, they built an army of 10,000 men, inconceivably gigantic for that time and place. When Muhammad heard about this force marching on Medina, he had his Muslims dig a moat around their town. The Quraysh arrived on camels, which would not or could not cross the moat. The stymied Quraysh decided to starve Medina with a siege. The siege strategy, however, scuttled a secret plan the Quraysh were counting on. After the disastrous Battle of Uhud, another of Medina's Jewish tribes had been exposed as collaborating with the Meccans. Like the first Jewish tribe, they had been tried and sent into exile. The third tribe, the Banu Qurayza, then proclaimed its loyalty to the Pact of Medina. Now, however, in the run-up to the Battle of the Moat, its leaders had secretly conspired with the Quraysh to fall upon the Muslim forces from behind as soon as the Meccan forces attacked from the front. When no frontal attack came, the conspirators within Medina lost their nerve. Meanwhile, the besieging force began to fragment, for it was a confederation of tribes, most of whom had come along only as a favor to their Qurayshi allies. With no battle to fight, they got restless. When a windstorm blew up no small matter in this landscape, they drifted off, and soon the Quraysh gave up and went home too. All this left the Banu Qurayza in a bad spot. Their plot had been discovered and now their allies were gone. Muhammad put the whole tribe on trial and appointed one of their former associates among the Medina tribes as judge. When the tribe was found guilty, the judge declared that the crime was treason, the punishment for which was death. Some onlookers protested against this sentence, but Muhammad confirmed the sentence, whereupon some 800 Jewish men were executed in the public square, and the women and children of the tribe were sent to live with the two tribes exiled earlier. This whole drama sent a shock wave through Arabia. The trial and execution of the Banu Qurayza announced the grim resolution of the Muslims of Medina. In strictly military terms, the Battle of the Moat was a stalemate, but the Quraysh had mustered a force of 10,000 with such fanfare that failing to win was as bad as losing, and this loss helped to stoke a growing myth of Muslim invincibility, communicating a broad impression that this community was not just another powerful tribe feeling its oats but something strange and new. The Muslims lived a distinctly different way of life, they practiced their own devotional rituals, and they had a leader who, when problems came up, went into a trance and channeled advice, he said, from a supernatural helper so powerful that Muslims had no fear of going into battle outnumbered 3-1. Who was this helper? At first, many of the unconverted might have thought, it's a really powerful God. But gradually the Muslim message sank in, not a God but the God, the only one. And what if Muhammad was exactly what he claimed to be, the one human being on earth directly connected to the creator of the entire universe? Recruiting people to kill the man grew ever more difficult. Recruiting warriors to go up against his forces grew difficult too. After the Battle of the Moat, the trickle of conversions to Islam became a flood. It's easy to suppose people were converting out of canny self-interest, a desire to join the winning side. Muslims, however, believe there was more to it. In Muhammad's presence, they believe, people were having a religious experience. Muhammad never claimed supernatural powers. He never claimed the ability to raise the dead, walk on water, or make the blind to see. He only claimed to speak for God, and he didn't claim that every word out of his mouth was God talking. Sometimes it was just Muhammad talking. How could people tell when it was God and when it was Muhammad? At the time, apparently, it was obvious. Today's Muslims have a special way of vocalizing the Quran called qiraat. It's a sound quite unlike any other made by the human voice. It's musical, but it isn't singing. It's incantatory, but it isn't chanting. It invokes emotion even in someone who doesn't understand the words. Every person who performs qiraat does so differently, but every recitation feels like an imitation or intimation or interpretation of some powerful original. When Muhammad delivered the Quran, he must have done so in this penetrating and emotional voice. When people heard the Quran from Muhammad, they were not just listening to words but experiencing an emotional force. Perhaps this is why Muslims insist that no translation of the Quran is the Quran. The true Quran is the whole package, indivisible, the words and their meanings, yes, but also the very sounds, even the look of the lettering when the Quran is in written form. To Muslims, it wasn't Muhammad the person but the Quran coming through Muhammad that was converting people. One other factor attracted people to the community and inspired them to believe Muhammad's claims. In this part of the world, small-scale warfare was endemic, as it seems to be in any area populated by many small nomadic tribes among whom trading blends into raiding, such as North America's eastern woodlands before Columbus arrived, or the Great Plains shortly after. Add the Arabian tradition of blood feuds lasting for generations, add also the tapestry of fragile tribal alliances that marked the peninsula at this time, and you have a world seething with constant, ubiquitous violence. Wherever Muhammad took over, he instructed people to live in peace with one another, and the converts did. By no means did he tell Muslims to eschew violence, for this community never hesitated to defend itself. Muslims still engaged in warfare, just not against one another. They expended their aggressive energy fighting the relentless outside threat to their survival. Those who joined the Ummah immediately entered Dar-ul-Islam, which means the realm of submission, to God, but also, by implication, the realm of peace. Everyone else was living out there in Dar-ul-Harb, the realm of war. Those who joined the Ummah didn't have to watch their backs anymore, not with their fellow Muslims. Converting also meant joining an inspiring social project, the construction of a just community of social equals. To keep that community alive, you had to fight, because the Ummah and its project had implacable enemies. Jihad never meant holy war or violence. Other words in Arabic mean fighting more unambiguously and are used as such in the Quran. A better translation for jihad might be struggle, with all the same connotations the word carries in the rhetoric of social justice movements familiar to the West. Struggle is deemed noble when it's struggle for a just cause, and if the cause demands armed struggle, that's okay too, it's sanctified by the cause. Over the next 2 years, tribes all across the Arabian Peninsula began accepting Muhammad's leadership, converting to Islam, and joining the community. One night Muhammad dreamed that he had returned to Mecca and found everyone there worshipping Allah. In the morning, he told his followers to pack for a pilgrimage. He led 1,400 Muslims on the 200-mile trek to Mecca. They came unarmed, despite the recent history of hostilities, but no battle broke out. The city closed its gates to the Muslims, but Quraysh elders came out and negotiated a treaty with Muhammad. The Muslims could not enter Mecca this year but could come back and perform their rites of pilgrimage next year. Clearly, the Quraysh knew the game was over. In year 6 AH, the Muslims came back to Mecca and visited the Kaaba without violence. 2 years later, the elders of Mecca surrendered the city to Muhammad without a fight. As his first act, the Prophet destroyed all the idols in the Kaaba and declared this cube with the black cornerstone the holiest spot in the world. A few of Muhammad's former enemies grumbled and muttered threats, but the tide had turned. Virtually all the tribes had united under Muhammad's banner, and all of Arabia was living in harmony for the first time in reported memory. In year 10 AH 632 CE, Muhammad made one more pilgrimage to Mecca and there gave a final sermon. He told the assembled men to regard the life and property of every Muslim as sacred, to respect the rights of all people including slaves, to acknowledge that women had rights over men just as men had rights over women, and to recognize that among Muslims no one stood higher or lower than anyone else except in virtue. He also said he was the last of God's messengers and that after him no further revelations would be coming to humanity. Shortly after returning to Medina, he fell ill. Burning with fever, he went from house to house, visiting his wives and friends, spending a moment or two with each one, and saying goodbye. He ended up with his wife Aisha, the daughter of his old friend Abu Bakr, and there, with his head in her lap, he died. Someone went out and gave the anxious crowd the news. At once, loyal Omar, one of Muhammad's fiercest and toughest but also one of his most hot-headed companions, jumped to his feet and warned that any man who spread such slander would lose limbs when his lie was exposed. Muhammad dead? Impossible. Then the older and more prudent Abu Bakr went to investigate. A moment later he came back and said, "O Muslims! Those of you who worshipped Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead. Those of you who worship Allah, know that Allah is alive and immortal." The words swept away Omar's rage and denial. He felt, he told friends later, as if the ground had been cut out from under him. He broke down crying, then, this strong bull of a man, because he realized that the news was true, God's messenger was dead. Chapter 3, Birth of the Caliphate. 11-24 AH. 632-644 CE. Devoted Muslims see the whole of Muhammad's life as a religious metaphor illuminating the meaning of existence, but the religious event does not end with the Prophet's death. It continues through the terms of his first 4 successors, remembered as the Rashidun, the rightly guided ones, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. The entire drama, from the revelation in the cave through the Hijra to the death of the Prophet's 4th successor almost 40 years later, forms the core religious allegory of Islam, analogous to the Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ in Christianity. Islam emerged well within literate times. People were writing journals, diaries, letters, bureaucratic documents, and other works. For this period a rich documentary record exists. It seems, then, as if the origins of Islam should lie squarely within the realm of journalism rather than legend. And yet, what we know about the life and times of these first 4 successors derives largely from a history written decades later by the writer Ibn Ishaq, who died in 151 AH, 768 CE. Ibn Ishaq came from a long line of traditionists, the archivists of oral culture, men and women whose job it was to gather, remember, and retell significant events. He was the first of his line to write the whole story down, but most of his book has been lost. Before it disappeared, however, other writers quoted from it, referred to it, included excerpts from it in their own works, wrote synopses of it, or paraphrased its stories. Recently, in fact, some academics have been trying to reconstruct Ibn Ishaq's work from the fragments of it found in other works. One historian who used Ibn Ishaq as his major source was Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, who died about 300 years after the Hijra. He wrote the 39-volume history of the prophets and kings that begins with Adam and ends in the year 292 AH, 915 CE. His work has survived into the present day, and most of the anecdotes and details we read about Muhammad and his successors come to us through him. It is he who tells us what color hair these men had, what their favorite food was, and how many camels they owned. He includes their key speeches and conversations as direct quotations. His history is not exactly a readable narrative, however, because each story is nested in a mind-numbing list of names, the isnad, or chain of transmission. X reports that Y told him that he heard from Z that, and finally the anecdote. After each anecdote comes a different version of the same anecdote, nested in a different isnad. A reports that he heard from B that C said that D recounts that anecdote. Tabari doesn't say which version is true, he just puts them out there for you the reader to decide. Over the centuries, writers have compiled their own versions of the most compelling anecdotes, some of which make their way into popular and oral accounts and eventually turn into the Islamic version of Bible stories, told to kids like me at home by our elders and in grammar school by our religion teachers. Overall, these stories chronicle a tumultuous human drama that unfolded in the first 29 years after the Prophet's death, a story of larger-than-life characters wrestling with epic issues, a story filled with episodes that evoke wonder and heartbreak. It's quite possible to take sides in retelling these stories, for there are sides to take, and it's quite possible to speculate about motives and make judgments about people's decisions. On the other hand, these anecdotes have acquired allegorical status. Different judgments and interpretations support different doctrines and represent various theological positions. We cannot know the hard facts of this story in a journalistic way because no untouched eyewitness account has survived. We have only the story of the story of the story, a sifting process that has drawn the mythological significance of the raw events to the surface. Here, then, is that story of the succession. The first Khalifa, 11 to 13 AH. The moment Muhammad died, the community faced an overwhelming problem. It wasn't just who is our next leader, but what is our next leader. When a saint dies, people can't simply name some other saint in his place, because such figures aren't created by election or appointment, they just emerge, and if they don't, oh well, people may be disappointed, but life goes on. When a king dies, by contrast, no one says, "Wouldn't it be nice if someday we had another king?" The gap must be plugged at once. When Prophet Muhammad died, it was like a saint dying, but it was also like a king dying. He was irreplaceable, yet someone had to take his place. Without a leader, the Ummah could not hold together. The new leader had to be more than a king, however, because this was not a community like any other. It was, its members believed, the embodiment of the revelations, existing to express Allah's will and thereby transform the world. The leader of this community could not get by on brains, bravery, strength, and such traits. He had to have some special religious grace or power. Yet Muhammad's successor would not be a God-guided messenger, because Muhammad himself had said there would be no more of those. So if the leader wouldn't be a king or a God-guided messenger, what would he be? Curiously enough, the nascent Muslim community had given no consideration to this question before the Prophet died, and it gave no consideration to it in the hours immediately after his death either, for this was not a time for grand philosophical discussions. With the Prophet's body scarcely cold, Abu Bakr heard a disturbing report: the native Muslims of Medina were meeting to elect a leader of their own, as if they and the immigrants from Mecca were separate groups. Here, quite possibly, was the beginning of the end of the Ummah. Abu Bakr gathered some of Muhammad's closest companions, crashed the meeting, and begged the Medinans to reconsider. Muslims should elect a single leader for the whole community. He pleaded, not a prophet, not a king, just someone to call meetings, moderate discussions, and hold the community together. Choose one of these two, he suggested, pointing to the irascible Omar and to another of the Prophet's close companions. Omar himself was appalled. Take precedence over Abu Bakr? Unthinkable. He grasped the older man's hand and told the assembly that only Abu Bakr could serve as leader, now that the Prophet himself was gone. Through tears, he swore allegiance to Muhammad's closest friend, a dramatic gesture that electrified the room. Suddenly Abu Bakr did seem like the obvious and only choice, this sensible, lovable man who had distinguished himself all his life by his wisdom, courage, and compassion. In a gush of enthusiasm, the meeting gave unanimous consent to letting Abu Bakr assume the modest title of Khalifa or, as most Western accounts would have it, Caliph, which meant deputy. This title did not exist until Abu Bakr took it on. No tribe or nation at that time was headed by a Khalifa. No one knew what the title meant or what powers it conferred. The first title holder would have to fill in those details. For now, Abu Bakr went to the mosque, where a crowd had gathered. His accession was announced. In a gracious inaugural speech he told that assembly, I am not the best of you. If I do well, support me. If I make mistakes, do not hesitate to advise me. If I neglect the laws of God and Prophet, I forfeit claim to your obedience. Everyone at the mosque gave him the same acclaim he had received from everyone at the meeting. Everyone, however, was not at the mosque or the meeting. One leading candidate for the role of successor did not even hear that the issue was being discussed. The Prophet's cousin Ali was washing the Prophet's body when the elders met. By the time he heard anything about the discussion, the decision had already been made. You can see how this might have rankled. In the last months of Muhammad's life, Ali may well have felt like he was the Prophet's successor, no discussion needed, for he stood closest to the Prophet in every way. Muhammad had several cousins, but Ali was special because his father Abu Talib had adopted Muhammad and raised him as a son, which essentially made Ali and Muhammad brothers. But Ali was almost 30 years Muhammad's junior, and in tribal Arab culture a much older brother had a near paternal status with his sibling. In fact, as a little boy, Ali had moved in with Muhammad and Khadija and King, just someone to call meetings, moderate discussions, and hold the community together. The Prophet's cousin Ali was washing the Prophet's body when the elders met. By the time he heard anything about the discussion, the decision had already been made. You can see how this might have rankled. In the last months of Muhammad's life, Ali may well have felt like he was the Prophet's successor, no discussion needed, for he stood closest to the Prophet in every way. Muhammad had several cousins, but Ali was special because his father Abu Talib had adopted Muhammad and raised him as a son, which essentially made Ali and Muhammad brothers. But Ali was almost 30 years Muhammad's junior, and in tribal Arab culture a much older brother had a near paternal status with his sibling. In fact, as a little boy, Ali had moved in with Muhammad and Khadija and preparing Muhammad's body for burial. Muhammad's peer group companions had been picking a successor for Muhammad, not only passing over Ali but failing even to consult him, failing even to inform him that the meeting was taking place. Surely, Ali felt he deserved some greater consideration than that. On the other hand, every point in Ali's favor counted against him from another perspective. Ali was close to the Prophet? Part of his family? Good for him, but when did Allah ever say he was conferring special privileges upon a particular family? Dynastic succession was the old way, the sort of thing Islam proposed to overturn. Besides, the Prophet had said there would be no more messengers after him. If this was true, Ali's charisma had no religious significance, in which case, shouldn't Muslims separate the Prophet's bloodline from leadership roles in the community to prevent undue concentrations of power from distorting the egalitarian universalism of the Islamic message? Seen in that light, in fact, wasn't Ali's charisma precisely the quality that made him questionable? Might it not encourage his more fervid partisans to declare him a new prophet? No, said Abu Bakr's proponents, what the community needed at this point was steady judgment, not youthful passion. Ali was just over 30 years of age at this time, Abu Bakr was almost 60. In the Arabia of that time, choosing a 30-year-old man as leader over a 60-year-old probably struck most Arabs as unthinkable. Why, the word sheikh, the title for tribal leader, literally meant old man. Some say it took Ali 6 hard months to concede the election, during which some of Abu Bakr's more unruly followers threatened him and roughed up his family. In one such shove and scuffle, they say, a door was slammed against his wife Fatima's belly, who was pregnant at the time, and this manhandling may have caused her to miscarry what would have been Prophet Muhammad's third grandson. Others claim that Ali swore allegiance to Abu Bakr just a few days after the latter took office. They minimize the abuse that Fatima suffered and attribute her miscarriage to an accident. A disagreement like this can never now be resolved by an appeal to evidence. It can only reflect the position one takes on the theological schism that developed out of the succession, for the disagreement between proponents of Abu Bakr and Ali eventually engendered two different sects of Islam, the Sunnis and the Shia, each of whom has a different version of these events. Ali's partisans developed into the Shia, a word that simply means partisans in Arabic, and they remain convinced to this day that Ali was the Prophet's only legitimate successor. In either case, within 6 months the rift had closed, and just in time, for a new crisis was threatening the survival of Islam. All across Arabia, tribes were seceding from the alliance that Muhammad had forged. Most claimed they had never pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr or the Ummah but only to Muhammad himself, and that pledge had been voided by Muhammad's death. Nominally, these tribes' people had all converted to Islam, and many of them insisted they were still Muslims. They still acknowledged the singleness of God and Muhammad's authority. They would still pray, still fast, still try to keep the drinking and debauchery under control, but zakat? The charity tax payable to the treasury at Medina? No, that they could no longer tolerate, no more payments to Medina. A few tribal leaders went further. They claimed that they themselves were now Allah's living messengers. They claimed they were receiving revelations and had permission to issue divinely authorized laws. These upstarts thought to use the model pioneered by Muhammad to forge sovereign sacred communities in competition with the Ummah. Had Abu Bakr allowed these departures, Islam would surely have gone in a very different direction. It might have evolved into a set of practices and beliefs that people embraced individually. But Abu Bakr responded to the crisis by declaring secession to be treason. The Prophet had said, "No compulsion in religion," and Abu Bakr did not deny that principle. People were free to accept or reject Islam as they pleased, but once they were in, he asserted, they were in for good. In response to a political crisis, Abu Bakr established a religious principle that haunts Islam to this day: the equation of apostasy with treason. Braided into this policy was the theological concept that the indissoluble singleness of God must be reflected in the indissoluble singleness of the Ummah. With this decision, Abu Bakr even more definitively confirmed Islam as a social project and not just a belief system. A Muslim community was not just a kind of community, of which there could be any number, but a particular community, of which there could be only one. The new Khalifa proved himself a formidable strategist. It took him a little over a year to end the rebellion known as the Apostate Wars and reunite Arabia. At home, however, in his dealings with the Muslim community, he exhibited nothing but the modesty, affection, and benevolence people knew and loved him for. A stoop-shouldered man with deep-set eyes, Abu Bakr dressed simply, lived plainly, and accumulated no wealth. His one affectation was to dye his hair and beard red with henna. When disputes arose, he dispensed justice with an even hand, involving a council of elders in all his decisions, ruling as first among equals, and asserting no claim to religious elevation. His word had no greater weight than any other Muslim's, and his authority came only from his wisdom and his devotion to the revelation. No one was obliged to follow his rulings except when he was right, the caveat being, he was pretty much always right. Back in Mecca, before the Hijrah, Abu Bakr had been a prosperous merchant. By the time Muslims emigrated to Medina, however, he had spent much of his fortune on charitable causes, especially buying freedom for slaves who converted to Islam, and he forfeited the rest of his wealth in the course of the move. As Khalifa, he took only a small salary for guiding the Ummah and continued to ply his old trade to make a living, getting by as best he could on the fruits of his shrunken business. Sometimes, he even milked his neighbor's cow for extra cash. As portrayed in the religious stories of Islamic tradition, children would run up to him shouting, "Papa! Papa!" when he walked through the streets of Medina, and he would pat their heads and give them candy. He was that kind of guy. The second Khalifa, 13 to 24 AH. One August day, 2 years into his caliphate, Abu Bakr stepped out of a hot bath into a blast of chill wind, and by nightfall he was running a high fever. Realizing that death was near, he called in a few of the community's top notables and told them he wanted to nominate Omar as his successor so there wouldn't be any arguments about it later. The notables balked, because Omar could not have been more different from the gentle, understated Abu Bakr. He was a giant of a man, looming half a head above anybody else in a crowd. He was said to stand out like a man on horseback. His head was completely bald, his face ruddy, his whiskers huge. He was ambidextrous and strong as a bull, and he had an epic temper. Before his conversion, Omar had been known to do a certain amount of brawling and drinking. Back then, he had hated Islam and Muhammad. Then came his oft-recounted conversion. One day, tradition reports, he announced that he was going to kill the messenger of God and be done with it. He grabbed a sword and went striding across town to commit the deed, but on the way he spotted his beloved sister sitting under a tree, studying a leaf with some sort of text on it. "What are you doing?" "Reading," she said. "Reading what?" She looked up timorously. "The Quran. I've become a Muslim." "What? Give me that." He snatched away what she was reading. It was a verse called Taha, and to Omar's astonishment the words seemed addressed directly to him. At that moment Omar went through a transformation. He dropped his sword, ran through the streets of Mecca, and banged on the Prophet's door, shouting, "I believe you. You are the messenger of God. I believe." After that, he became one of Muhammad's closest companions, but he always remained a tough guy's tough guy, subject to outbursts of frightening rage, and though he had a good heart beneath it all, many wondered if the caliphate could be entrusted to a man whose very demeanor frightened children. At that critical moment, however, Ali stepped forward to endorse Omar, and his word tipped the scales. The Ummah accepted their second post, Muhammad leader. Upon taking office, Omar told the community that he knew he was more feared than loved, but he assured people, they had seen only one side of him so far. Both the Prophet and Abu Bakr had been tender-hearted men, he explained, yet leaders sometimes must take tough action, and when such a need had arisen, Omar had been their instrument. He had needed to be a sword all the time so that the Prophet, and later Abu Bakr, would have a sword available to them any time. Now that Omar was Khalifa, however, he would not be a living sword all the time, because he knew that a leader must sometimes be gentle. From now on, therefore, the community would see both sides of him. Wrongdoers and tyrants who trampled on the weak would see the old Omar. The poor, the weak, the widows, the orphans, all who sought the good and needed protection, would see the tender Omar. The Ummah soon realized their second Khalifa was a towering personality, even more imposing than Abu Bakr, perhaps. Omar directed the Ummah for 10 years, and during that time he set the course of Islamic theology, he shaped Islam as a political ideology, he gave Islamic civilization its characteristic stamp, and he built an empire that ended up bigger than Rome. Any one of these achievements could have earned him a place in a who's who of history's most influential figures. The sum of them make him something like a combination of St. Paul, Karl Marx, Lorenzo de' Medici, and Napoleon. Yet most people outside Islam know him only as a name and perhaps a 1 or 2 sentence descriptor. He's the second Khalifa, a successor of Muhammad, that's about it. Perhaps this is because Omar made lack of pretension his core principle. This is so much a part of his legend that Omar becomes in Islamic tradition the embodiment of a principle. His word was not law, his will did not rule, he ceded all authority to God, such was his storied claim. He envisioned Islam as an absolutely just and egalitarian community, and he intended to make that vision a reality. In the Muslim community, he said, no one ever needed to fear the whims or will of any human power because this community had the Quran as its law, and the example of the Prophet's life as its guide, and nothing else was needed. Omar declared that his role was merely to keep the Ummah united and moving forward along the track indicated by the revelations. Omar had never been a rich man, but Ali and others urged him to take a suitable salary from the public treasury, arguing that since Islam now included all of Arabia, the Ummah could no longer afford a part-time Khalifa who milked a cow for extra cash. Omar agreed but appointed a commission to calculate how much he needed to live like the average Arab, no better and no worse, and supposedly set this amount as his salary. Imagine the CEO of a modern multinational corporation doing that. In imitation of the Prophet, Omar habitually patched his own clothes, sometimes while conducting important state business. At night, after his official duties were done, the stories portray him shouldering a bag of grain and roaming through the city, personally delivering food to families in need. Once, somebody who saw him at this labor offered to carry the bag for him, but Omar said, "You can carry my burden for me here on earth, but who will carry it for me on the day of judgment?" It's easy to suppose such stories are purely apocryphal, or that, if true, they merely show Omar the politician demonstrating a common touch for show. Personally, I think he must have been strikingly pious, unpretentious, devoted, and empathic, just as the stories suggest. The anecdotes are too consistent to dismiss, and something must account for this man's overpowering impact on his contemporaries. Whatever the reality, however, the legend he planted in the Muslim imagination expresses an ideal of how rulers should behave. Omar adopted a title that became an enduring addendum to Khalifa, Amir-ul, or Commander of the Faithful, a title that conflated his spiritual and military roles. As a big-picture military strategist, Omar ranked with Alexander and Julius Caesar, but how he acquired such savvy is hard to fathom. Until Islam came along, he was just another small-town merchant. He took part in those iconic early battles of Muslim history, but in military terms those were little more than skirmishes. Now, suddenly, he was studying world, i.e., Middle World, maps, calculating the flow of Byzantine or Sassanid resources, gauging what geography dictated for strategy, deciding where to force a battle and where to retreat. He was operating on a global scale. Fortuitously, at this historical moment, the Ummah produced an extraordinary array of brilliant field commanders such as Khalid bin al-Walid, hero of the apostate wars, Umar ibn al-As, conqueror of Egypt, and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, who beat the Persians. As soon as Omar took office, he finished a piece of military business that Abu Bakr had started. Toward the end of the apostate wars, seeing Arabia in turmoil, the Byzantines had moved troops to the border, intending to absorb this troubled territory. Abu Bakr had sent men to keep them at bay, but even before his death the Muslims had pushed the Byzantines back into their own territory. Shortly after Omar took the helm, they set siege to the city of Damascus. From that time on, Muslims had the Byzantines on the run, and in 636 CE, at a place called Yarmouk, they destroyed the main Byzantine army. Meanwhile, the Persians were doing their best to unravel the upstart Muslim community with spies and provocateurs. Instead of swatting at individual Persian agents, Omar decided to throttle the threat at its source. He called on Muslims to topple the Sassanid Empire, a proposal of breathtaking audacity, ants vowing to fell a mastiff. Omar's decision to call a war of conquest a jihad has obvious ramifications for modern times and has been much debated. In Muhammad's day, the word jihad did not loom large. Etymologically, as I said, it didn't mean fighting but striving, and though it could be applied to fighting an enemy, it could also be used to discuss striving against temptation, struggling for justice, or trying to develop one's compassion. The word jihad as fighting does come up in the Quran, bound explicitly to self-defense. Those verses were revealed at a time when the Quraysh were trying to erase Islam and Muslims from the face of the earth. In that context, it was no stretch to argue that fighting had a moral dimension. If the community of believers was what made justice possible on earth, then those who let hostile forces extinguish it were helping Satan, while those who put lives and property at risk to defend it were serving Allah. But calling upon Muslims to leave home, travel to distant lands, and fight people with whom they had virtually no previous interaction, how could wars such as these be called defensive? And if they weren't defensive, how could they qualify as jihad? They were connected through an idea that originated in Muhammad's time and that Muslim thinkers began fleshing out during Abu Bakr and Omar's caliphates, the idea that the world was divided into the mutually exclusive realms of Dar-ul-Islam and Dar-ul-Harb, the realm of peace and the realm of war. This schema depicted Islam as an oasis of brotherhood and peace surrounded by a universe of chaos and hatred. Anything a person did to expand Dar-ul-Islam constituted action in the cause of peace, even fighting and bloodshed, because it shrank the realm of war. Personally, I wonder how many people in the 7th century thought wars of conquest needed justification. In any case, calling a campaign of conquest a jihad met with no dispute among the Ummah. Having survived the shock of Prophet Muhammad's death, they had regrouped, and Omar probably understood that setting them a heroic quest at this juncture would consolidate and deepen their unity. In 15 AH, or thereabouts, near a town called Qadisiyah, an Arab force traditionally numbered at 30,000 warriors found itself facing a Sassanid army of 60,000 crack troops. Only a river separated them. Several times, the Arab commander Waqqas sent envoys to negotiate with Rustam, the commander of the Sassanid force. As the story goes, General Rustam asked one envoy if he headed up the Muslim army. The man replied, "No, we're Muslims. Among us, there is no highest and lowest." Rustam said, "Look, I know you Arabs are hungry and poor, and I'm sure you've been causing trouble out of desperation. So I tell you what, I'll give each of you 2 suits of clothing and a bag of dates. Will that convince you to go back where you came from?" The Muslim envoy said, "We're not here to take anything from you, General. We're here to give you Islam. You are headed to hell, we offer you an opportunity to go to heaven." Rustam just laughed. "You remind me of the mouse that crept into the granary through a hole in the wall and ate till he could eat no more. Then he tried to go home, but he had grown too fat to fit back through the hole. His greed trapped him in the granary and the cat killed him. Now, you greedy Arabs have stolen into our granary and you're trapped. All of you will die here, like that mouse." Eventually, in all this back and forth, the Muslims told Rustam, "If you don't want to convert, just pay the tax, and you won't be harmed." "Harmed?" scoffed Rustam. "Tax? He told his servants to give the Muslims a bag of dirt, by which he meant to symbolize the grave. But the Muslims received it cheerfully. "You give us your soil? We accept." Both sides then prepared for battle. Despite his own greedy mouse anecdote, Rustam made the mistake of crossing the river to attack the Muslims, so his were the forces backed up against the river with nowhere to flee. The Battle of Qadisiyah lasted 4 days, the Persians riding elephants, the Arabs camels. On the 3rd day, the battle went on through the night and into the next day. When the Sassanids gave way at last, thousands of their routed warriors tried to swim the river in heavy armor and drowned. Along with warriors, many poets, including some women, went to this battlefield and generated a rich trove of stories, elevating Qadisiyah to a mythic status, like a shorter Trojan War. For example, as soon as victory was certain, a courier jumped on a horse and headed for Arabia to deliver the good news. Approaching Medina, he passed a geezer by the side of the road, some simple fellow in a patched coat, who jumped to his feet and asked the courier if he had come from Qadisiyah. "Yes," said the courier. "What's the news, then?" "What's the news?" the old man asked eagerly. But the courier said he couldn't stop to chat and he rode on. The old man trotted after him, pestering him with questions. When they passed through the city gates, a crowd gathered. "Out of my way!" the courier yelled importantly. "I must see the Khalifa at once." "Where is Khalifa Omar?" The crowd burst out laughing. "That's him right behind you." No pomp, that was Omar's style, according to legend. After Qadisiyah, the Arabs took the Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon and then just kept marching, eating into the centuries-old Sassanid Empire, until the entire territory belonged to Muslims and the Sassanid Empire was no more. In 3 years they put an end to an empire that had gone toe-to-toe with Rome for centuries. Meanwhile, other armies were routing the Byzantines along the Mediterranean coast, down through Egypt, and into North Africa. The crown jewel of these conquests was Jerusalem, which ranked just behind Mecca and Medina as a holy site for Muslims, in part because Muhammad had reported a vision of being briefly lifted to paradise from this city during his lifetime. One of the most famous Omar stories took place after this city fell. The Khalifa made his way to Jerusalem to accept its surrender in person. He traveled with a servant, and since they had only one donkey between them, they took turns riding and walking. When they reached Jerusalem, the servant happened to be riding. The people of Jerusalem mistook him for the Khalifa and hastened to pay him obeisance. They had to be told, "No, no, that's nobody, it's the other guy you should be saluting." The Christians assumed that the Khalifa of Islam would want to perform the Muslim prayer in their most hallowed church as a token of his triumph, but Omar refused to set foot in there. "If I do," he explained, "some future Muslim will use it as an excuse to seize the building and turn it into a mosque, and that's not what we've come here to do. That's not the sort of thing we Muslims do. Continue to live and worship as you please, just know that from now on we Muslims will be living among you, worshipping in our way, and setting a better example. If you like what you see, join us. If not, so be it. Allah has told us, no compulsion in religion." Omar's treatment of Jerusalem set the pattern for relations between Muslims and the people they conquered. Christians found that under Muslim rule they would be subject to a special poll tax called the jizya. That was the bad news. The good news: the jizya would generally be less than the taxes they had been paying to their Byzantine overlords who did interfere with their religious practices, because the nuances of ritual and belief among various Christian sects mattered to them, whereas to the Muslims they were all just Christians. The idea of lower taxes and greater religious freedom struck Christians as a pretty good deal, and so Muslims faced little or no local resistance in former Byzantine territory. In fact, Jews and Christians sometimes joined them in fighting the Byzantines. By the time Omar died, Islamic rule covered more than 2 million square miles. How was this possible? Religious Muslims offer the simple explanation that Muslims had the irresistible supernatural aid of Allah. Academic historians explain that the Byzantine and Sassanid empires had just fought a ruinous war with each other, and despite their seeming might, they were both rotten to the core and ready to fall. Another often cited explanation holds that Muslims fought more ferociously than others because they believed that they would go directly to heaven if they were killed and get 72 virgins. I can't comment on that, but I will suggest some other factors. Those early Muslims had a sense that they were fighting for something apocalyptically great. They felt that fighting for their cause made their lives meaningful and would give their deaths meaning as well. People have proven time and again that they will attack extraordinary obstacles and endure tremendous hardships if they think the effort will impart meaning to their lives. The human hunger for meaning is a craving as fundamental as food and drink. Everyday life gives people little opportunity for this sort of nourishment, which is one reason why people get swept along by narratives that cast them as key players in apocalyptic dramas. Muslim warriors in the time of Khalifa Omar had that sense about their lives. Developments back home kept their idealism alive, because Omar enforced what he practiced and practiced what he preached. Under his guidance, Medina did reflect the values that Muslims said they were bringing to the world: fellowship, fairness, harmony, decency, democratic participation in decision-making, equality, and compassion. At the very least, the Muslim community during the early caliphate exemplified these ideals so much more than ordinary empires, that later Muslims could easily polish the accounts of that time into a memory of lost perfection. On the other side of the line, people heard story after story about Muslims scoring military victories against astounding odds. Resistance seemed useless against such a force. Besides, common folk had little incentive to resist, since the conquest wouldn't affect their lives. Their potentates would lose their treasures, but the masses would keep what they had and go on as before. Had the Arabs been fighting civilian populations defending their homes, it would have been a tougher fight that probably would have eroded their idealism over time. But instead, even far from home, they were mostly fighting mercenaries and draftees. Let me not minimize a final factor intertwined with the hunger for meaning. War gave Muslims opportunities for plunder. Under Omar, however, soldiers had no permission to seize the fixed property of common citizens. They got battlefield loot and the treasuries of the monarchs they conquered, which, incidentally, was plenty. 4/5 of whatever they won was divided equally among the soldiers, supposedly with no distinction among commanders and foot soldiers, generals, and privates. That was the Muslim way. 1/5 of the plunder went back to Medina. In the Prophet's day, much of that money was distributed immediately to the needy, and this policy persisted, though in ever more diluted form, through Omar's day. Add all these factors together, and the sudden expansion of Islam was not so inexplicable after all. Conquest led the surge, but conquest was kept separate from conversion. There was no conversion by the sword. Muslims insisted on holding political power but not on their subjects being Muslims. Instead, wherever Muslim armies flowed, cultural transmission followed. News of the Muslim social project proliferated quickly because the expansion covered pretty much exactly the world historical area sewn together by those ancient trade routes running between major seas and waterways. In its first 50 years, Islam expanded to the western edge of the Indian Ocean, to the eastern lip of the Mediterranean Sea, to the Nile, to the Caspian Sea, to the Persian Gulf. In this area, this intercommunicative zone so richly permeated with pre-existing channels of interaction, Muslim stories and ideas went humming from person to person through gossip and tale-telling, street talk and scholarly debate, flowing easily because the ideas were not that new. The Zoroastrian world hovered on the brink of monotheism. The Byzantine world had come into it with Christianity. And of course, ages ago, Judaism had introduced radical monotheism to the Levant, the region between Mesopotamia and Egypt. The whole time Omar the Conqueror was directing the territorial expansion of Islam, Omar the spiritual leader was directing the consolidation of Muslim doctrine and defining the Islamic way of life. Abu Bakr had established that Islam was not just an abstract ideal of community, but one particular community with a world-changing destiny. Omar formalized this by declaring a new calendar that began, not with the birth of Muhammad, nor with the first revelations, but with the Hijra, the migration of Muslims to Medina. Omar's calendar enshrined the conviction that Islam was not just a plan for individual salvation, but a plan for how the world should run. Many religions say to their followers, "The world is corrupt, but you can escape it." Islam said to its followers, "The world is corrupt, but you can change it." Perhaps this was inherent from the earliest days of Muhammad's preaching, but Omar confirmed this course for Islam and set it on tracks of iron. Abu Bakr had ruled with legendary humility, trying never to impose his own will but merely administering the directives set forth by the Quran and the Prophet. Omar made this attitude a cornerstone of Muslim doctrine, a seminal decision because in vowing to do only what the revelations directed, he committed Muslims to determining what the revelations directed in every possible case, great and small. During Abu Bakr's caliphate, at Omar's suggestion, all the pieces of the Quran were compiled in one place. It was a miscellaneous collection at first, because when the revelations were coming in, people recorded them on anything that came to hand: a sheet of parchment, a piece of leather, a stone, a bone, whatever. As Khalifa, Omar began a sorting process. In his presence, each written verse was checked against the memorized version kept by the professional reciters whom this society regarded as the most reliable keepers of information. Scribes then recorded the authorized copy of each verse before witnesses, and these verses were organized into one comprehensive collection. Whenever a difficult decision came up, Omar looked here for the answer. If the Quran didn't provide an answer, he consulted with the community to find out what the Prophet had said or done in a similar situation. In this case, the community meant the several hundred men and women who had been Muhammad's companions during his lifetime. Every time the community made a ruling in this way, Omar had scribes record it and sent the ruling out to provincial governors to use as a basis for their decisions. Omar funded a body of scholars to spend all their time steeping themselves in the revelations, the stories of Muhammad's life, and other pertinent data, so that when he needed expert advice he could get it from these people of the bench, a seed that grew into one of Islam's major social institutions, the ulama, or scholars. Even as he was shaping Muslim law, Omar was busy applying the doctrine to social life in Medina, which brings us to his stern side. Omar had no tolerance for slack arts. For example, he banned drinking outright, even though the Quran had been somewhat ambiguous on this question, seeming in some early verses to disapprove more of drunkenness than of drinking per se, although later verses ban it more definitely. The Quran specified no particular punishment for drinking, but Omar deduced one by analogy. The analogy in this case went as follows: the Quran prescribed the lash for slander. Drinking, said Omar, made a person spout slander. Therefore, the punishment for drinking must also be the lash. This mode of argument by analogy, qiyas, created a stencil used prolifically by later Muslim legal thinkers. Dreading the destructive power of unlicensed sex, Omar enforced the sternest measures against adultery. In fact, he mandated stoning for adulterers, which is not mentioned in the Quran but does appear in the Law of Moses, dating to pre-Quranic times, Deuteronomy 22:22. He also banned the Arab custom of temporary marriage, which allowed men to marry women for a few days. The Khalifa recognized prostitution when he saw it. Shiite jurists later relegitimized this practice in their codes. Omar's detractors charge him with misogyny, and his rulings do suggest that he held women responsible for the bad behavior of men. To defuse the disruptive power of sexuality, Omar took measures to regulate and separate the roles of men and women, mandating, for example, that women and men pray separately, presumably so they wouldn't be thinking about sex during that ritual. This was, however, a far cry from the separation of the sexes and the disempowerment of women that developed in Islamic societies centuries later, and persists to this day. It's true, of course, that gender relationships in Medina did not conform to modern feminist ideals. Tribal Arabs, and most early cultures, saw separate and non-overlapping roles for men and women, and Islam confirmed the separation. In Omar's day, however, education was compulsory for both boys and girls in the Muslim community. Women worked alongside men, they took part in public life, they attended lectures, delivered sermons, composed poetry for public orations, went to war as relief workers, and sometimes even took part in fighting. Important decisions facing the community were discussed in public meetings. Omar participated in those meetings as just another citizen of the community, and women as well as men engaged him fearlessly in debate. In fact, Omar appointed a woman as head of the market in Medina, which was a position of great civic responsibility, for it included duties such as regulating construction, issuing business permits, and policing the integrity of weights and measures. Even so, Omar did plant seeds that eventually developed into a severe constriction of women's participation in public life. In the 7th century CE, every society in the world permitted slavery, and Arabia was no exception. Islam did not ban the practice, but it did limit a master's power over a slave, and Omar enforced these rulings strictly. No Muslim could be a slave. If a man impregnated a slave, he had to marry her, which meant that her child would be born a Muslim and therefore free. Slavery could not result in breaking up a family, which limited a master's options. He could only buy or sell whole families. Masters could not abuse or mistreat slaves, who had the same human rights as free folks, a theme stressed in the Quran and specifically reaffirmed in Prophet Muhammad's final sermon. Omar ruled a master had to give his slaves the same food he was eating and in fact had to have his slaves eat with his family. If Omar's rulings had been carried to their logical conclusions, slavery might have ended in the Muslim world in the early days of the Caliphate. Instead, Muslim societies regressed in this matter. Ironically, Omar's own career ended when an emotionally unstable Persian slave drove a knife into his belly at the mosque. On his deathbed, some of the community's notables asked him to nominate his successor as Abu Bakr had done, in order to ensure a smooth transition. "How about your son?" they suggested. Omar flew into his last rage. "Do you think I did this job to benefit myself and my family?" He died later that day, but before his death he established another consequential precedent. He named a 6-man consultative committee, a shura, to select a new Khalifa and seek the consensus of the Ummah on their choice. Many later Muslim thinkers looked to the shura as the basis for democratic institutions in Islam. The shura discovered that 2 men, Ali and Uthman, were everybody's first and second choices, some favoring Ali and some Uthman. Ali, remember, was Muhammad's son-in-law who had already been passed over twice. The chairman of the shura interviewed both men in front of an assembly of the people, posing one key question to each: if you become Khalifa, will you be guided by the Quran, the Sunnah, and the precedents set by Abu Bakr and Omar? Ali said yes to the Quran and yes to the Sunnah, the example set by Muhammad's life, but as for the decisions of his predecessors, no. Ali said he had a mind of his own and would consult his own conscience and best judgment for his decisions. Uthman, by contrast, said yes to everything. "I am not an innovator." So the chairman declared him the right man to head the Ummah, the people approved, and Ali, not wanting to rock the boat, took the oath of loyalty. That is all for now. If you want to know what happened next to the Muslim dynasty, stick around for the part 2 of this video. Please like and subscribe to our channel and turn on the notifications so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.